Okay, thank you very, very much. I'd like to welcome you to Bristol Law School at UWE and to tonight's Centre for Legal Research annual lecture. I'd like to also thank not only you for turning up this evening, for all the people at UWE who've helped to bring this event around, including my colleague Dr. Ben Ponting, who's at the front there, who's the head of the Environmental Law Unit within the law school, for his idea for inviting George here this evening. I'd also like to thank both the students who are currently doing exams who are here this evening, the staff who have attended, who are marking the exams, but also particularly to anyone here who's coming to UWE for the first time, and we really appreciate you turning up for this event. Just a couple of housekeeping matters before we do begin. The first one, perhaps the most obvious one, is relating to phones. Can you either switch them off or ensure that they are on silent? That's very much appreciated. I'd also like to say a thank you to Bristol Cream Capital and to Professor Jim Longhurst, who have supported this event financially, and without their support this event couldn't have taken place. So our speaker this evening, of course, is George Monbiot, and I'm absolutely delighted to be able to introduce him. I'm going to keep my introduction very, very short because you're not here to listen to me. Some of my students who are here this evening have to listen to me, but fortunately you don't. You're here to listen to George. What can I say? Over the last 3 decades, George has both been an activist and I think a scholar. He's been a writer, and he has written a series of thought-provoking books. He has, I think, led discussion on a whole range of issues relating to the environment and related political, institutional and economic issues within this country, and not only within this country, but in terms of global issues as well, in particular in relation to things that I've certainly read his work on in relation to climate change, as well as a vast range of other concerns as well. For those of you that haven't seen George in action before in terms of how he debates with people, I would recommend that you go onto YouTube and watch his, I was going to say dismemberment, but that's not fair, his dismantlement of one of my childhood heroes, which is David Bellamy, over the issue of man-made climate change. It's a little bit unfair, but in that actual particular debate, Jon Snow, it's a Channel 4 News debate, actually makes reference to George Galloway, not George Galloway, David Bellamy. He's definitely not here this evening, I think we've been noticed. Makes reference to David Bellamy's viewpoint as bullshit, which I've never ever seen Jon Snow do that before, but there we go. There'll be none of that this evening. We'll be very, very nice to each other. George is going to talk for about 40 minutes, 45 minutes, and we're going to have about 40, 45 minutes of Q&A. Which George is going to be in charge of, because he's very kindly agreed to do that. What I would say is we have to finish at 7 o'clock, because George does have to get a train later this evening, so it's important you stop at that time. At the end, Jim Longhurst will kindly come down to the front and say thank you on behalf of all of us. And so with no further ado, please give a round of applause to our guest speaker this evening.
Thanks very much, Phil, and thank you everybody for coming along this evening. I've been asked to talk about the legislative aspects of rewilding. Well, I'll be talking mostly about rewilding and throwing those in when I can. I'm no expert in this, and in fact, few people are. One of the things we're hoping to do with the new group, which is just about to be launched, Rewilding Britain, is to investigate exactly these and to find out whether they are as difficult to negotiate as they first appear to be. But I'll be dropping those in discussion of the legislative aspects as I go along, telling you about what I really want to talk about, which is rewilding. So, I studied zoology at university, but I didn't really grasp the extraordinary, fantastic nature of ecology until I was working in the Amazon, where I fell in with a bunch of scientists who were right at the frontiers of their discipline. Almost every month they were making fantastic new discoveries. And all their discoveries really reinforce the same story, which is that if you want to maintain the maximum of biodiversity and the dynamism and function of ecosystems, then you should try to prevent the forests from being cut down and turned into ranches. It seemed fairly obvious lesson, and many of us for a long, long time have been campaigning for exactly that. And it wasn't for a very long time that the obvious lesson emerged for me. It wasn't until I had moved to mid-Wales, where I lived until fairly recently, in a state of great excitement, because here I was moving from a city in England to a little tiny town called Machynlleth, with the Cambrian Mountains on one side of me, with Snowdonia on the other side, with about 1,000 square kilometres across which I could freely roam. I could go in any direction from my back door and walk all day long, often without seeing a single human being. And at first I responded like a battery chicken let out of its cage. I was overwhelmed by choice. I was just sort of sat there stunned, saying, almost stressed out by the amount of paths that I could take, and having great difficulty in choosing between them. But after a while my excitement gave way to puzzlement, and my puzzlement gave way to disappointment, and my disappointment gave way to despair, because in whichever direction I walked, I saw the same thing, or rather didn't see the same things. There was nothing there. It wasn't just that there were no human beings, there was almost no wildlife either. The most obvious thing I noticed straight away was there were no trees. Trees were virtually an endangered species in both regions, especially when you get up above about 500 feet, there's just no trees at all, nothing whatsoever. Birds, you could walk all day long, literally, and see 2 crows, maybe a pipit if you were lucky. You could get down on your hands and knees in the middle of summer and push through the sward. There were no insects either. It was extraordinary. It was a wet desert. I was in the middle of a desert. So I did what people do in deserts when they're stuck in a desert, which was to look for an oasis. And I went onto the website of the local wildlife trust, Montgomeryshire Wildlife Trust, and saw straight away a reserve which they flagged as really wild. They said, this is our flagship reserve, the Glaslyn Reserve. This is the place to come to if you want to get away from human intervention and come to a place where wildlife is allowed to do its own thing. Oh, that's a place for me. Fantastic. Get away from these bare, ruined, sheep-wrecked hills which surrounded me. I'm going to go to the Glaslyn Reserve. And I went to the Glaslyn Reserve and I walked straight out the other side without realising I'd got there. Because it was exactly the same as all the land which surrounded it. There was nothing there except low grass, a tiny bit of heather, and sodding sheep everywhere. And I thought, something's gone horribly wrong here. Someone's let the sheep in. So I phoned up Montgomeryshire Wildlife Trust and said, something's gone terribly wrong with your reserve. You know, someone's opened a gate or something because the sheep have got in there and they've ruined everything. There's nothing left. And they said, it was meant to be like that. I said, I beg your pardon. They said, it's meant to be like that. It's that's what we're protecting is the grass and the heather. And I said, well, could I see your management plan? They said, well, you'll have to join. So okay, I sent them the money and I said, can I see your management plan now? They said, oh, all right then. So they sent me the management plan. And it's true, it was meant to be like that. It was prescribed. I mean, not just like we're going to have some grass and some heather. It's like, the grass in this part of the reserve must be no more than 10 centimetres high. The heather over here must be no more than 30 centimetres high. We have a major problem with invasive, undesirable species which have to be constantly removed every year. And so I phoned them and I said, what are these invasive, undesirable species? They said, trees. And I said, what, you mean like sort of Sitka spruce, sort of exotic conifers which are sort of seed blowing? And so no, it's all these sort of like hawthorns and rowans and birches. They keep springing up, you know, because it costs us a fortune to get rid of them. And I said, why? Why are you doing this? Why are you cutting it and burning it and grazing it in a nature reserve? Why? And they said, well, we've got to keep this is sites of special scientific interest. And sites of special scientific interest, and that term, warm your heart. Sites of special scientific interest have interest features in them which have to be kept in favourable conditions, and those conditions are prescribed by law. This is our first contact with the law. And if we don't keep them in favourable condition, we're breaking the law. And I said, well, how can anyone, seeing this nuclear winter that you're maintaining in this reserve, call that favourable condition? And so, well, you're keeping these habitats in favourable condition, which are the heather and the grass. And I said, well, why these habitats? Why are you maintaining these at the expense of the trees which want to come back? And they said, oh, well, because we're legally obliged to, it's designated for this. When you create a site of special scientific interest, you create it basically around what's already there, and you have to keep it in the state in which you found it. So I said, so even if someone has just dropped the bomb on that place, that's the state in which it has to remain forevermore. And they said, yes. I said, well, who's making you do this? They said, well, the Countryside Council for Wales, which at the time was a statutory body, now been replaced by Natural Resources Wales. So I went to the head of the Countryside Council for Wales, who was a great guy, and I said, why are you telling Montgomeryshire Wildlife Trust to maintain their reserve in this state of complete ecological devastation where there's no wildlife, there's no birds, there's no insects, there's nothing except sheep? Why is that a statutory obligation? And he said, well, look, you've got a point. I understand what you're saying, but it's the law. We would be breaking the law if we told them anything else. And so I said, well, who's telling you to do it then? Right? Where's this law coming from? Well, he said, you'll have to talk to the JNCC, who are the UK statutory body, the Joint Nature Conservation Committee, who set these laws, who say what favourable condition is and what the interest features are. So I went to the JNCC and said, why are you telling CCW to tell MWT to trash their reserve? And they said, oh, not us, Gov. It's the European Commission. It's a Habitats Directive. That says what the interest features that have to be preserved in the UK are, and they specify what favourable condition is. So I went to the European Commission and said, why are you telling JNCC to tell CCW to tell MWT to trash their reserve? And they said, oh, not us, Gov. It's the national statutory agencies which tell us what the interest features should be, which we then put onto the Habitat Directive as an annex, and we then pass it down as this is what you must preserve. So I realised I was looking at a totally circular process over which no one was taking responsibility at all. So I go back to the Montgomeryshire Wildlife Trust and say, look, I'm just trying to figure out why it is that it's this feature and not any of these other potential features, which is what you're preserving here. And they said, well, because these are the habitats which support, when they're in favourable condition, these interest features, they support our key indicator species. And I said, so what are those? Oh, well, skylarks, yeah, okay, you won't have seen any. Big ouzels, no, you won't have seen any of those either. Red grouse, and they named a few, none of which were there most of the time. But they named a few of these species, all of which happen to be among the very few birds which can survive without cover. The great majority of all species require cover. They, just as I was seeing in the Amazon, they require architecture, so structural diversity, so there's lots of different little niches for them to live in. They require places where they can shelter from predators, hide from predators or ambush prey, or hide from extremes of temperature and humidity. Very few species can live in open habitats, but the ones that they'd selected as their key indicator species happen to be among the very few which could live in open habitats. So I said, well, why are you selecting these as your key indicator species? And they said, oh, because those are indicators that our interest features are in favourable condition. So the interest features these interest features have to be chosen because they support these key indicator species. These key indicator species have been chosen because they show that those interest features are in favourable condition. I realised I was facing another wholly circular form of reasoning here. And then suddenly the revelation hit me, far later than it should have done, that while in the Amazon and in most parts of the world the conservationists are trying to preserve the rainforest from the ranches, here in Britain we're preserving the ranches from the rainforests. And all the things which we campaign against everywhere else on earth, where we say stop that cutting, stop that burning, stop that grazing, we regard as essential conservation tools in this country. That we have to cut and burn and graze our living systems, because otherwise something will go horribly wrong. I don't know, they'll get out of control. They'll do things which aren't in the management plan. The grass won't be 10 centimetres high anymore. species might come in which aren't allowed in, which are legally prohibited. They will appear, and then, who knows what will happen? Anarchy, disorder, terrible, terrible things will happen, because that's the sort of thing that nature does. Can't be trusted. It doesn't live by the rules. And as my friend Richie Tassel says, and how did nature cope before we came along? and I realised as I looked around that this was a prevailing ethos across our uplands. And the uplands, for me, should be the very special places, because they're the places where nothing else makes any sense except effectively leaving them to nature. Our uplands are universally bare, and they've been kept universally bare by a series of completely uneconomic activities, which, just like the blasted post-nuclear winter landscapes which we have come to see as being essential to our heritage, we see those activities too as being essential in some way or another. But it's always hard to pin down exactly why they're so important, but they're so important. And one of those is sheep farming on a very large, extensive scale. Now, yeah, I absorb the basic environmental narrative that intensive farming is bad, extensive farming is less bad, before living in Wales and realising, this is just as bad. This is just as bad. I mean, if you look at the productivity versus damage done, 76% of the land area of Wales is under livestock, almost all for meat. Wales imports by value 7 times as much meat as it exports. That's how unproductive it is. And to maintain this almost total failure of productivity, 3/4 of the land area is kept completely bare by one industry. And short of scallop dredging, I can't think of any other industry which has a higher environmental impact against the food and the production that it's responsible for. It's just wildly, crazily disproportionate. And that impact knocks on beyond that area itself, because if you remove all the vegetation from the watersheds, when the rain hits those watersheds, and rain mostly falls on the hills, then it flashes off. It doesn't get absorbed, it's not slowed down, and you get a cycle of droughts and floods, a cycle which incidentally does massive damage to agriculture downstream, where agriculture is actually productive. And the only reason why there's any hill farming taking place at all in this country is because of public subsidies. It just doesn't make any economic sense at all. It's a massively loss-making activity, and we are paying to have our ecosystems wrecked and our houses flooded. That's what we pay £3 billion a year for in this country. It does not make any sense. The other land uses in the uplands are grass shooting and deer stalking, both for a tiny elite, the 0.0001%. And yet enormous tracts of land are being kept bare and burnt and overgrazed and all the rest on behalf of those activities. Again, it's senseless. But then you realise that this has been so absorbed into the culture. I mean, we talk to people like the National Parks or the National Trust, and they say, well, these are cultural landscapes. Sure, they're cultural landscapes, but why is there this exclusive cultural focus? Why is there only one kind of cultural landscape? I had an argument with the previous director of the National Trust, Fiona Reynolds, on the radio, and she was saying, well, sheep are part of our cultural landscape. And I said, well, yeah, but wolves are part of our cultural landscape too. But all we've got is sheep. Why do we only have sheep? And I realised that this cultural landscape argument is actually a cultural hegemony argument. Antonio Gramsci would see this as cultural hegemony, that this is the dominant land use, the dominant, the people at the top of the hierarchy define what the culture is, create the framing and the parameters for that culture until everybody comes to see what works for them, as they come to universalise and internalise it and say, oh yes, that's our culture. The culture of the aristocrats is our culture. The aristocratic view of Britain, that's Britain. And we internalise that culture until it becomes hegemonic. So perhaps in this case we could call it agricultural hegemony. And so we've sort of come to see this to such an extent that conservation itself comes to conserve the agricultural, devastated, ruined landscape. to see how ruined it is, we have really to understand the concept formulated by the fisheries biologist Daniel Pauling of shifting baseline syndrome. The shifting baseline syndrome says that we normalise and conceive as natural the ecosystems which prevailed in our own youth. And so, I might look back on what prevailed in my own youth and think of the woolly mammoths and the saber-toothed cattle. I look back on the rivers which were so dense with eels around the autumn equinox that they looked black. The beds of the rivers were black with eels, with the European eel, which is now critically endangered. I think of the moths which covered the windows on summer evenings. I think of the fields which were white with mushrooms. And I look back and say, that's the way it ought to be, without recognising that that itself was a state of extreme depletion. And within every generation that passes, that ratchet is turned a little further. And so you conceive as natural and normal an even more depleted state than the previous generation conceived as natural and normal. And until we regard these highly degraded and depleted systems, which are missing all the top links in the food chain, as being natural and normal and how it ought to be and how it ought to be preserved. And so we start protecting what there is rather than what there could be. And to give you an example of how far shifting baseline has gone and how far removed we are from understanding our own ecosystems, what surrounds us, I want to pose a series of questions which become interesting when one knows the answer, what I think is the answer. Why is it possible to lay a hedge? You think of what a traditional hedge layer does. They whack the living daylights out of the trees. They almost sever the living wood, leaving just a tiny sliver of wood and bark. They twist it, they split it, they trample it down. And yet, poof, the trees come back as vigorously as ever before the following year. How did they acquire that extraordinary adaptation? I mean, isn't that an amazing thing for a tree to be able to do? Why would it be able to resist such amazing pressures? Deer don't do that to trees. The wind doesn't do that to trees. Why are trees able to coppice and pollard, to resprout from whatever point the trunk is broken, even in late maturity? Why are understory trees, like holly and box and yew, so much tougher and harder to break and to topple than canopy trees, the tall oak and beech and ash and lime and the rest of it, even though they carry less weight and are subject to lower shear forces from the wind? Why does birch have black and white bark? These seem like completely disparate and unconnected questions, but I believe they all have the same answer. Elephants. This is an elephant-adapted ecosystem that we live in. During the last interglacial period, the Eemian, which had a very similar temperature and climate to our own, and all the familiar wildlife lived here that we know today, or much of it, foxes and hedgehogs and badgers and magpies and robins and elephants and rhinos and hippos and lions and hyenas and scimitar cats. We had a megafauna. Everywhere on Earth had a megafauna. Megafaunas are the default states of all ecosystems, and all ecosystems are still adapted to those megafaunas, even if the megafaunas have disappeared. The same at sea. 1776, Oliver Goldsmith, in his encyclopedia, described the arrival of the herring as seen from an English coastline. He says the main body of the fish was split into columns, each 4 or 5 miles wide and 2 or 3 miles 4 or 5 miles long and 2 or 3 miles wide. They rolled up the water ahead of them. They created a bow wave. They were followed by shoals of cod, shoals of tope and spurdog, following them the larger sharks and the tuna, the longfin tuna, the bluefin tuna. Behind them the dolphins and the porpoises, and behind them, within sight of the English shore, the pods of sperm whales and fin whales come in to harvest the herring. We had a terrestrial megafauna, we had a marine megafauna, and we have forgotten about it through shifting baseline syndrome. Even our mesofauna we now see as exotic and weird the wolves, the lynxes, the beavers, the boar, the other species which some of us want to bring back. These are regarded by many people as alien intruders, and yet they're an essential, a critical part of our ecosystems. Ecosystems without these keystone species. A keystone species is a species whose ecological impact is greater than its numbers and its biomass alone would suggest. Without these keystone species, ecosystems behave in radically different ways to the ways they behave in the presence of those species. Classic example is what happened when wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone National Park in 1995 after an absence of 70 years. Now we think of wolves as killing machines, as these lethal creatures who go around wiping out wildlife, but in reality they give life to many more species than they attack. And what happened was that within 6 years of the wolves arriving, the height of the trees in some of the valleys had quintupled. The number of migratory songbirds greatly increased. The number of rodents increased. The number of scavenging birds like bald eagles and ravens increased. Bear numbers went up, bison numbers went up, beaver numbers went up, followed by otter numbers and muskrats and fish and invertebrates in the rivers and ducks. The ecosystem was transformed by the reintroduction of wolves. Well, how was this possible? What happened was that the wolves had come into an area which was much like the Scottish Highlands, greatly overpopulated by deer which had not been controlled because there were no predators to control them. And it wasn't just that they reduced the numbers of deer, but they created what ecologists call a landscape of fear. They drove the deer out of the places where they could easily be trapped, the river valleys, the gorges, the twisty turny bits, and the deer moved out of those into other areas, and you started to get a mosaic of habitats developing where previously you'd had this sort of monoculture of bare land. And so in those places the trees started coming back, and amazingly it wasn't just that the ecosystem was transformed, the physical geography started to change as well. The rivers began to meander less because the roots of the trees started to stabilise their banks. They formed more pools and riffle sections, also very good for wildlife. The soil was eroding at lower rates on the hillsides because the vegetation was coming back. As the deer moved to some areas and not into others, their dung created different floral systems, different collections of plants in some areas to in other areas. So you started to get a greater diversity of habitats developing, all from the introduction of a couple of packs of wolves into an area almost the size of Norfolk. This extraordinary transformation of the ecosystem from the reintroduction of keystone species. Something similar appears to have been happening in Ireland, and it's happening at the moment. It's a remarkable phenomenon which at first appeared inexplicable. We've seen in this country how grey squirrels, introduced for the first time from North America in the 19th century, have swept across the country, killing off the red squirrels, causing a lot of problems. They rip young trees to bits and make it very hard for forestry to establish. They raid nests. They've been considered as an almost insoluble problem of an invasive species. But often we discover that an invasive species is a big problem only when it's moving into an empty ecosystem, an ecosystem which has lost many of its trophic layers, its top layers in the chain of life, and it's occupying a vacuum. Well, in Ireland, this extraordinary thing has been happening where, by complete contrast to experience elsewhere, the grey squirrels are rolling back at great speed. They've now vacated a great swathe of the country 100 kilometres wide in the past just 20 years, and the red squirrels have moved in and reoccupied that territory that they'd been pushed out on. How? How has this happened? It seems that the pine marten, it's a sort of stoat-like animal. Someone described it as an otter in a dinner jacket. It's a very attractive creature which can climb trees, member of the mustelid family, the stoat otter badger family, it loves grey squirrels in the purely carnal sense. It's been allowed to expand from its western redoubts just simply through people stopping killing it. Gamekeepers have stopped killing it because they're not allowed to anymore. Well, probably a few still do, but but much less than before. And while it hunts red squirrels have a very simple adaptation for escaping from pine martens. They're small and light enough to get to the very end of the twigs where the pine martens can't follow them. By comparison, the grey squirrel is a great lump. It's much more terrestrial in its habitat. It forages on the woodland floor much more than the red squirrel does. And it's dead meat as far as pine martens are concerned. It meals on legs. It hasn't got any of the adaptations required because it didn't co-evolve with pine martens to escape from them. And pine martens find them very tasty indeed. And it looks as if it's the spread of the pine marten which has been responsible for the disappearance of the grey squirrel. But it turns out that so many grey squirrels have disappeared so quickly that it couldn't possibly have been because the pine martens are eating them all. Now, they couldn't have eaten that many in such a short amount of time. It seems that, like the wolves, they created an ecology of fear. In this case, the grey squirrels are so sodding terrified when pine martens turn up that they quite literally spend the whole summer looking over their shoulders instead of putting on enough weight to get them through the winter, and they starve to death in the winter. It's an extraordinary phenomenon and happening with great speed. These are examples of what ecologists call trophic cascades. Trophics to do with feeding and eating and being eaten. Cascade, you know what that is. These are ecological processes which tumble from the top of an ecosystem down to the bottom. And when in the Dark Ages I studied zoology, we were taught that basically ecosystems work from the bottom up. You get a particular soil type, a particular climate, a sort of physical geography of the site that determines what sort of vegetation you get, which determines your herbivore population, which determines your carnivore population. It now seems in many ecosystems that have been studied, it's the other way around. That understanding we had then was an artifact of studying highly depleted ecosystems from which those top trophic layers had been removed. So if you want ecosystems to function, if you want them to be dynamic, if you don't want them to be like the jar of pickles, which I've seen in too many conservation sites, nothing allowed in, nothing allowed out, everything locked down. If you actually want to see nature doing what it does best, which is constantly to change and to move, to be fluid, to be dynamic, you have to have your keystone species in. And I mentioned at the beginning that we're about to launch a new organisation for Britain called Rewilding Britain. And one of our key aims is to bring back some of those keystone species. We want to have large areas of land which are going to be put aside for nature to do its own thing. We also want to have a lot of human interaction and engagement with those. We want to revitalise local communities by providing income and employment for them. But above all else, we want to bring back some of the species which drive these dynamic processes. Species such as boar, beavers, lynx, wolves, moose, bison, and then pelicans, goshawks, which are already beginning to come back, grey whales possibly in the estuaries, and a really important keystone species. We'd love to see sturgeon one day running up our rivers again. They can get to 18 feet long. They used to be common throughout Britain. And there's a whole range of species in which we're taking an interest. And here we bump up against some of the other legislative barriers which we've only just begun to understand. So this is, as I say, fairly rudimentary, I'm afraid, on the legal side. But the ones we've come across so far are more or less as follows. There's a Dangerous Wild Animals Act 1976, which lists all the wild animals which are considered to be dangerous, and says that if you're going to introduce them, it must be done only into enclosures and must be done under the following rigorous conditions and supervision and the rest of it. And almost all the mammals that we're interested in are on that list. The boar, the moose, the wolf, the lynx, the bison, they're listed there, and that effectively says you have a very big hoop to jump through if you're going to release them outside of an enclosure. You have a pretty big hoop to jump through releasing them inside an enclosure, but far worse if you want to release them outside. And that's something we've got to work out how great a barrier is that going to be. You've then got the zoo legislation, which says that if you release an animal into an enclosure, it can't be with predators. So if you've got a herbivore enclosure, you can't have herbivores and predators in the same enclosure. So it's like, right, you've got your Dangerous Wild Animals Act, which says it has to be an enclosure, you've got this zoo legislation. It just makes it impossible. You cannot have a functioning ecosystem in this country by law. It is illegal to have a functioning ecosystem. So that's going to be a tough one to negotiate. And then we got the Infrastructure Act 2015 just passed. Some of us were lobbying against these clauses, or many other clauses. It was one of these horrendous omnibus bills into which a whole load of things have been stuffed, completely unrelated matters, including maximising the economic recovery of petroleum. It becomes a legal duty of the government. And so here we've got a government under the Climate Change Act 2008 is legally obliged to minimise greenhouse gas emissions, and the same government, in fact the same Secretary of State, is simultaneously under the Infrastructure Act 2015 legally obliged to maximise the economic recovery of petroleum. How does this work without that person's head exploding? Who knows? But anyway, so you've got that in it. You've got a whole lot of stuff about building roads, all sorts of weird stuff about police. There's all sorts of strange stuff. And buried right in the middle of this, what it's got to do with infrastructure is anyone's guess. And as I say, I think these things are completely undemocratic because, how can you make an intelligible decision on this? If you're an MP and you say, right, do you accept 120 completely contradictory propositions in this bill, yes or no? Well, what you want to say is, well, I accept that and not that and the rest of it. You can't make a sensible vote on that basis. And it makes democracy a dead letter if you have bills like that. But anyway, buried in the middle of this is this these sections about native and non-native species. And it's got all this stuff about invasive non-native species, but then it's got these clauses about species that were formerly native and are no longer ordinarily present in the United Kingdom. And that these, just like the non-native invasive species, can be subject to control agreements or control orders. It's funny how this language comes up in different places, but control orders sort of used as a sort of extrajudicial means of basically sitting on people that you haven't got any evidence against, but you don't like the look of them, and then control orders, the same language used to control species that you haven't got any evidence against, but you don't like the look of them either. And they have specifically inserted onto that list of species beavers and boar, basically to make sure that if beavers and boar get out, which is currently the only means in most places by which they're going to come back, that they can be rounded up and shot. And when it comes to wild boar, you've got this extraordinary situation where the government has basically, aside from introducing this, has washed its hand of the legal decision and said, we're going to leave it to landowners to decide what to do about the boar. Well, the boar don't belong to them. They belong to everyone and no one. The boar belong to themselves. The boar are they're part of our cultural landscape now, and we should decide as a nation whether we want to have the wild boar or not. Why it should be left to this tiny percentage of the nation. I mean, landowners, we're possibly have the second highest concentration of land ownership in the world in this country after Brazil, where tiny numbers of people own all the land. We have a very rapid consolidation of land ownership taking place at the moment, 2% a year. There's a rate of consolidation which is faster than at any period since the Highland clearances. And that's taking place in Britain at the moment. No one's talking about it. It's one of our many socially constructed silences. Why should that group, the 0.001%, why should they decide what happens to wild boar? Why should this not be a national democratic decision? So you've got these two forces, which basically means that unless we have a fight back, we're going to lose a species which has recently been rewilded in this country and is an absolutely essential keystone species. I mean, wild boar create habitats for thousands of species by their wallowing, by their rooting and grubbing. They create what the ecologists in the Amazon call an intermediate disturbance regime. So not mass destruction, but sort of turning over soil and making enough of a mess to allow lots of other species to establish themselves in places where they wouldn't otherwise be able to establish themselves. So there's this long annex of of species in Schedule, well, they've amended Schedule 9 of the Wildlife and Countryside Act to say, here are these non-native species which should be controlled, here are these formerly native, no longer ordinarily present species which should be controlled. We're going to lump them all together and call them a problem, and now we're going to have these draconian control orders to deal with them, and I'm going to put them in detention for 90 days with an electronic tag on or something, no access to computers or however it's going to work. So that's one of the problems that we're negotiating. Now, just to give you a flavour of how profoundly cockeyed and biased this is, in Schedule 9 of the Wildlife and Countryside Act, which has just been amended by the Infrastructure Act 2015, there's this list of potentially invasive species which need to be controlled. And on it are 3 species of pheasant. There's the Reeves pheasant, the Lady Amherst pheasant, and the silver pheasant, all extremely rare. One would really hesitate to call them invasive. You very, very seldom see them. Very beautiful pheasants, every one of them. They're exotic pheasants, you know, and you see them in wildlife parks and private collections because their plumage is so beautiful. And very occasionally one of them gets out, and there's a control order against you. You go kill those pheasants because they might take over. Landowners are releasing 40 million ringneck pheasants in this country every year. They're just as non-native as those other species. They come from Central Asia. And yet there are at least 40 million of them. No environmental impact required whatsoever, not on the schedule, because of course they can't be a problem, because landowners are, well, people like us are releasing them. Of God's sake, you can't call those non-native. You're ending up calling us non-native next, you know. And this extraordinary blind spot, you know, like there's maybe 1,000 of the other pheasants at large in this country. There are 40 million released every year of these ringneck pheasants. And they cause massive problems. They eat loads of reptiles, they eat all the lizards, the baby snakes, they eat all the insects, lots of other invertebrates, they eat baby plants, they're omnivorous, you know, they're really stripped woodland ecologies bare. There's not even any studies showing the extent of it. You know, the government commissions nothing. You know, if it says there's a problem, it's a problem with buzzards eating this, so we've got to kill the buzzards. It's an extraordinary situation. And just pause for a moment, look at the legal status of the pheasant. Because when the pheasant's being bred, when it's in enclosures, it's classified as livestock, which enables those who are breeding it to escape from VAT and from various forms of planning control, because it's an agricultural activity because they're livestock. But you're not allowed to go around shooting livestock with shotguns. That's against the law. It's against the animal welfare legislation. So as soon as they're released, they become wild animals. They're legally, they're legislatively classified as wild animals as soon as they're released. However, at the end of the shooting season, the shoots tend to round them up and catch them with nets so that they can then use them as breeding stock for the next year. Whereupon they become livestock, because you're not allowed to round up wild animals and catch them with nets. So they have to be reclassified as livestock at that point. If, however, these livestock rip your garden apart, or cause damage to your property, or smash up your car, or smash up the people in the car when you have collisions with them, suddenly they become wild animals again for legal purposes, even if when they do so at the time when you're rounding them up as livestock with nets. I mean, truly, the pheasant should be a rich subject of study for ecologists, because it metamorphoses more than any animal in Ovid. And so what you can see here is this sort of the law creating these torturous processes to allow the 0.01% to carry on doing what it does, because there's no way legally that those activities would be allowed if the law was applied impartially to all animal species, and at the same time the law coming down on a ton of bricks on those species which this very, very conservative group, the big landowners, don't want to see being re-established in this country. So, yeah, we've certainly got a job in hand to challenge some of that. But we're hoping that through such challenges, and with the help of people an awful lot cleverer than me as far as these things are concerned, you know, because we believe we can negotiate some of this, we just have to understand it a lot better than we do at present. We can begin to create a country which, in some places at least, gives us some relief from this intensely controlling and managed and ordered and gridded and really deathly system within which we live all the time, and from which we can't escape without going halfway around the world. To be in places which are self-willed, which are self-managed, which aren't controlled from above, which aren't clamped down upon, which aren't prescribed, which don't have a management plan where everything is managed to the last percentage point. This is as important for us, I believe, as it is for the wildlife which we want to combat. For me, rewilding, which its first definition for me is a mass restoration of ecosystems, the second definition is to find a richer and rawer life for ourselves, to find places in which we can step, in which wild and wonderful processes are allowed to take place once more, in which we don't know what we're going to see, because the places will change. To be able to snorkel over cold water reefs which have been allowed to reform because they're not being constantly trawled over with beam trawlers and scallop dredgers and all the other instruments of mass destruction which are allowed. The commercial fishing is banned from 0.01% of our territorial waters. 5 square kilometres out of 48,000. Everywhere else you're allowed to trash it. What an extraordinary situation that is. And how wonderful it would be if, say, 30% of that water was allowed to do its own thing, and you could dive in it. It would probably be clear again, because you go back far enough, the North Sea seems to have been crystal clear, all the seas around here, because the seabed was stabilised by life forms, by oysters the size of dinner plates, by soft water corals, by all the other bivalves, and they also filtered the water. When Europeans first arrived in Chesapeake Bay in North America, this vast area of water, the calculations suggest that the oysters in that bay filtered the entire water column every 3 days. So any suspended sediments, anything which made the water dirty, that was filtered out. So you had these clear, crystal clear seas with this incredible wealth of life, this great structural complexity, this architecture of the kind that you get in the rainforest. We had all that, with the monstrous lobsters trundling over them, with the vast shoals of cod, with the bluefin tuna coming in to whack the herring, with the whales of many different species, the humpbacks, the fins, the sperm whales, all within British waters. We could have that back. And in areas, we're looking at areas of 100,000 hectares or more, which are going to be big enough to have viable populations of lynx and of wolves, as well as boar and beaver and many of the other species we want to move back. Places where people who live locally might be able to find the sort of economic activities which can keep those communities alive in a way that sheep farming is patently failing to do, despite us throwing £3 billion in subsidies at it every year. To have self-supporting communities where the schools stay open, where the shops stay open, where the chapels stay open, where most importantly the pubs stay open. None of which is happening at the moment, where we see this total social failure, economic failure, alongside the ecological failure that is taking place. And above all, perhaps, it enables us to reintroduce something which is even rarer than some of the species I've been talking about, especially in environmental circles, that very scarce commodity called hope. Because what rewilding tells us is that ecological processes don't all have to go in one way, down the hill. It doesn't all have to be a story of ever-increasing destruction, that we can turn that around and allow this to become one element of a positive environmentalism, which we so badly lack. And not for a moment saying we should stop fighting against the bad stuff. We have to keep fighting against the bad stuff. But at the moment, just about the only message that environmentalists put out is, follow us and the world will be slightly less crap than it would otherwise have been. Doesn't that inspire you? How about follow us and the world could be a whole lot better than it is at the moment. The world could be filled with wonder and enchantment once more, with birdsong, with the cries of animals, with amazing trees, with all sorts of fantastic things we don't currently have. Isn't that a better way of enticing people, of bringing them in, if you're trying to get people to love nature and to fight for nature, an ounce of hope is worth a ton of despair. What we hope to do is to replace our silent spring with a raucous summer. Thank you. Here for the audience. Is there someone who can pass it around? Or maybe we could pass it up and down. It would take a bit longer if the... Are you sure about that?
Yep.
You don't mind? Are you sure? Is that okay? Thank you. Thank you very much. Sorry. We'll certainly be keeping you fit. What I like to do is to go woman, man, otherwise we know what happens. So is there a woman who'd like to start us off? Right, there's a woman right here. Keep your hand up till you get the mic. Is the mic not on yet? Yeah, it's coming. There we go. Keep your hand up with the red net scarf. Yeah.
Very interesting, thank you. I was just wondering, with regard particularly to the large landowners in this country, what would be your strategy as part of Rewilding Britain to communicating with those large landowners? Would it be a personal basis, or would it be more of a strategic top-down thing?
Thank you. No, it's a very good question, and one which we're beginning to devote quite a lot of time to. A couple of us went up to the Scottish Highlands a couple of weeks ago and met people in the course of 9 days responsible for about 1 million hectares of land, an awful lot of land. And you'd be amazed, things are really beginning to change. And it's led by a few of them who are saying, well, yeah, okay, we can see the writing on the wall. I mean, it helps that in Scotland they've got a land reform consultation going on. They're saying, basically, if you're not delivering services to this country, we're going to expropriate your land. So, they're feeling the pressure. That helps a great deal. So, as usual, Scotland is the place to be, in a country which is now dead from the neck down. But there seemed to me to be a lot of hope there. And we were meeting large and small landowners who were sort of suddenly thinking, this is exciting, and to excite them, to inspire them with the idea is definitely part of it. But there are going to be others who are going to be much less susceptible to that. More exciting from my point of view are the community groups which are trying to do it. And a classic example is Trees for Life in Scotland, which is a group set up by a bunch of hippies who love trees, and they want to see more trees. They want to get some of the Caledonian forest beginning to spread again, and they started this in 1986, and they've been able through public subscription to buy an estate, but they've also managed to persuade various neighbouring landowners, including the Forestry Commission. They've had great success with them to start rewilding some of their own land, and things are really beginning to spread there. And that's the model I'm particularly attracted to, and what we aim to do with Rewilding Britain is to offer support to groups like that, and to groups all around the country who are interested in rewilding, not just at the very large scale, but also at a much smaller scale. We'd like to see rewilding sites. Obviously, they might not be able to contain wolves and lynx, but much closer to people's homes, within cities and around cities. We'd love to see buffer zones around the rivers, which would not only provide wonderful wildlife corridors and rich habitats in their own right, but would also prevent floods by creating what they call hydraulic roughness, which greatly slows down the water, and prevent farm chemicals and the rest of it from getting into the water supply. There's all sorts of things you can do which have multiple functions, but bring people close to nature and nature close to people. So there's a whole lot of people that we're going to have to work with and negotiate with, and I think we'll have to use different approaches for different people. But above all, we want people to do their own initiatives, which we can then champion. We don't want to be handing it down and saying, this is what you should be doing, and this qualifies and this doesn't qualify. What we want is for people to say, here's what we're doing, here are our initiatives, and then we say, right, well, maybe we can help you with that. We can help you get some funding, we could help get some publicity, we could help create a better political environment for this to thrive in. So, question from a man we'll allow now. Man over there. We'll do one or two from this side to stop Phil exhausting himself, and then we'll come over to this side. So.
I wanted to ask you, so you mentioned the Yellowstone wolf example, which was a success, but there's been a lot of reintroductions that haven't worked. So what kind of legal system would you promote which would enable successful reintroductions?
Thank you, yeah. I should say that one of the determinants of success is whether there's public support. Because if you just release a whole lot of lynx or wolves without winning people over first, they're just going to get shot. It's as simple as that. It's just not going to work. And it's wrong. It's undemocratic to do it without getting public support for it in the first place. It's got to be done with the consent and enthusiasm of the nation as a whole and of local people as well. And so, I support the legislation which says, and it's in there in the European Habitats Directive. It says it's got to be through a proper consultative process and all that. I would support that. It's certainly the Habitat Directive is as much use as a chocolate teapot. So in principle, it's for reintroductions, but in practice, it says what's the wording it uses? So the government is something like should investigate the desirability or something like this. It's a study the desirability. That's all. That's the only obligation on member states. So people say, well, the Habitat Directive says we should be reintroducing missing species. And you say, well, yeah, but it doesn't actually do anything about it. But in terms of enabling legislation, I mean, I would love to see a firmer signal coming from the European Union. Might not be relevant to England after a while, but there we go. But I'd also love to see something like that enshrined in British law under the Wildlife and Countryside Act, for example, to say we will actively advance the reintroduction of missing species, particularly keystone species, these ecosystem engineers, but it's got to be done through proper democratic processes. So I'll go for another woman on this side, and then we'll switch over to the other side. Yep, behind you, Phil.
You mentioned Scotland, but what about the south of England?
Could you move the mic down a little so everyone can hear it?
Yeah, you mentioned Scotland, but what about what are the hopes of doing that kind of thing in the south of England? Say, a couple of years ago I went to the New Forest, and I hadn't been there since I was a child, and I was quite horrified at what a kind of desert that seemed to be. So is there any hope of somewhere like that with rewilding it?
Thank you. Well, we certainly want to see large-scale rewilding projects in all three of the nations of Britain. I mean, specifically Britain, not Ireland. So, but with Scotland, by comparison to England and Wales, is going to be relatively easy because these very big estates which are pretty well ready to go. But in England and Wales, it's definitely harder. But it's not impossible. It's getting the scale which is going to be difficult. There's an estate in Sussex called the Knepp Estate, which is 1,400 hectares, which is already rewilded in its entirety. And it's an amazing place. It was wheat fields. It was entirely wheat fields, just very intensive. And they found they weren't making any money from it because it's on this very tough wheeled clay, and they just didn't have the yields to justify the investment they were putting in. All they were doing was getting themselves in hot to the banks. So they tried something completely different, and they put a few longhorn cattle, which sort of mimic the giant aurochs that used to live here, a few Tamworth pigs, which are close as you can get to a wild boar without encountering the Dangerous Wild Animals Act, and then allowed a whole lot of wild deer to come in, and they've created this sort of wood pasture environment which looks like the East African savannas. It's just amazing, and it's swarming with wildlife. They now, within 14 years of doing this, they have 2% of the nation's nightingales nesting there. They have, it's the second best site in Britain for purple emperor butterflies. They're swarming with smooth snakes, with woodlarks, with southern damselflies, with water violet, with all these really, really rare species. And the bird song and the insect noise there is like overwhelming. It's so different from everywhere else. And so it can be done, but by and large, I want to see this happen on infertile places, because I don't want to see large areas of food production taken away. We're going to need the food, and in places like the uplands where the productivity is is so minimal as to be completely insignificant, then you don't have that clash. But in the lowlands, you can easily have that clash. And I know that the Blue Finger project round here, is saying, this very, very good Grade 1 agricultural land should be used for growing food. It should not be concreted over. And I completely agree with that. Nor should it just be turned over to wildlife, because that is very important land. But where land is less good for agriculture, well, there are going to be opportunities, but they're not going to be, in southern England, they're not going to be so great. I've been talking incidentally to the managers of the New Forest and trying to push them a little bit further along the spectrum, and it's not, they're not hostile to the idea, put it that way. So we'll move to this side if you don't mind. There's a man already with his hand up. Keep your hand up so Phil can see you. Yeah.
Hi, sorry, two small questions. Firstly, slightly boring. So the Habitats Directive and the Birds Directive are being reviewed at a European level, which feeds down to things like SACs and SBAs and designations in the UK. Are there any opportunities there? I mean, most environmental groups seem quite scared of any possible changes. Are there some opportunities there to make rewilding more easy? Secondly, I've lived in Findhorn Druid actually, which I know you've been to, and it's really exciting working with Trees for Life. So if you've got any more details about how that's going to work, that'd be really interesting. I know they've got some huge areas of land they own, and how you could sort of fence that off to the outside world. So any insights you've got there would be interesting too.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Well, you're right that there are potential opportunities. I mean, the Habitats Directive and the Birds Directive are under threat at the moment. They could be greatly watered down because there's this whole deregulatory drive within the European Union. I mean, interestingly, the person they put in charge of the sort of deregulation review in Europe, Edmund Stoiber, who was previously president of Bavaria, he said environmental legislation has no major impact on business whatsoever. It's of all the costs of regulation, it accounts for less than 1% of the total cost of regulation. So all this sort of great hoo-ha in the corporate press, nightingales are killing our economy, and all this sort of total, it's just complete rubbish. And this is from the horse's mouth. This is sort of Stoiber, who's this sort of hard-nosed, straight down the line, neoliberal, deregulatory bloke. He's saying it's just not a problem. Why are we obsessing about environmental legislation? And yet, despite the Stoiber review, what's very interesting is that Juncker and his administration are ignoring the results of their own review by still waging war on the Habitats Directive and the Bird Directive, even though Stoiber said they're not a problem. So we have to protect what's good about them, and there's a lot that's good about them, and so there is good reason for people to fear that they might be diluted. But you're right. At the same time, there are potential opportunities, and I don't have any expertise in that area, but I am talking to people who are trying to see if those opportunities can be opened up during this review process, because that would be a wonderful thing. If we could come, if it starts with this sort of attempt to dilute it and ends up with them being stronger than before, well, that would be a great outcome. On the Findhorn thing and Trees for Life, Trees for Life was founded by a man who lives at Findhorn called Alan Watson Featherstone, as you know, who's a really remarkable character and an inspiring man. You talk about sort of fencing areas off. I mean, that's certainly not his vision, and certainly not my vision either. I mean, at the moment, yes, there are areas where, because the deer numbers have been kept so high by the stalking estates, until you can strike an agreement to get those numbers down below the sort of livestock-like densities which are being kept at the moment, which means that no trees can survive at all, then you do have to create what they call exclosures, areas which are fenced off to allow a few trees to start to come back. But Alan's aim and our aim is eventually that those fences can come down. But one of the ironies in Scotland, here I am talking about trying to have as little human intervention as possible. But one of the ironies in Scotland is that to start off the process of rewilding, the first thing you have to do is to intervene quite heavily to get those deer numbers down, because they don't have any natural predators, and because they're fed in the winter by the stalking estates, basically, so that any banker turning up in his helicopter from London, waddling over the moors with a set of +4s, can basically fire a shot at random and kill a deer. That's how it is. I mean, they call it sport. It's just beyond contemplation. It's literally like shooting sheep. There's so many of them. And they're packed in, you just sort of, you put a blindfold on and sort of shoot that way, you're going to hit one. But in some places they're like 40 deer per square kilometre. It's insane. And it's not till you get the level down to about 5 per square kilometre that trees can grow. That's why the highlands are bare. There'd be trees in most parts of the highlands if it weren't for the fact that there's such huge numbers of deer. So you do have to bring those deer numbers down. And luckily, through the land reform consultation, the Scottish Government is saying this, you can no longer treat the land like this. And there are these deer management groups, which are basically, at the moment, they're just a whole bunch of landowners get together, how many deer did you kill this year? And they don't have any scientific basis or anything to them. It's just, they just have a drink and then they go away again. But it looks like the Scottish Government wants to take control of those and actually really make a serious effort. Because then, my ideal is you get the numbers down, you get the forests coming back, you then put the lynx and the wolves back in, and then you don't have to intervene anymore. You don't have to intervene and get the deer numbers down because they'll do it for you. Is there a woman on this side? There are several women on this side. Phil, come down to the front if you don't mind, Phil. Fit on here.
Hi, I just wondered if you had any thoughts about rewilding parks, because I think I get a glimmer of the sort of existentialist angst that you feel in Wales whenever I go into a municipal park, and it seems a real cultural landscape that we are very kind of blind to the potential of. Oh, sorry, I haven't turned it on, but anyway, you got it, didn't you?
Thank you. Well, yes, I think there's all sorts of scope. In fact, we heard from someone from Bristol City Council. We had a little seminar this afternoon who was talking about just that and saying people really love it if you have those little wildflower bits and stuff like that in parks. I would love to see a lot more of that, and I would love to see trees in parks, but also in conservation woodlands, allowed to do their own thing more. If huge branches fall off, then just leave the branch there. Let's see what happens. Kids will play on those branches. They'll love them. They're sort of natural playground. And then the branches start to rot, and all sorts of things start to live in them. And interesting stuff happens. Trees are cut down. If there's the slightest whiff of some potential danger to the public, even if it's really, really small, but I think we'll accept a little bit of danger in return for having interesting ecosystems develop and those trees allowed to become hollow and all the rest of it. You can even take it a bit, given that we don't have elephants, unfortunately, yet. This might be some way down the line. I think there are some, while I'm sort of generally, I feel we intervene far too much, and generally I'd like us to manage as little as possible. I think there are some clever things potentially we could do with trees. And already one or two far-sighted foresters are beginning to do them. They call it veterinization, making trees sort of age faster in a way. Because you go into a park or conservation woodland or anything, and the trees are basically, they're all straight and healthy and fine, which is lovely. But a healthy forest ecosystem has trees in every stage of death and decay. It's the old ecologist saying, which is absolutely true, that there's more life in dead wood than there is in living wood. Because there's huge numbers of species which are adapted to live in dead or indeed moribund wood. And the reason for that is elephants, that they were creating vast amounts of that. We're basically ripping trees apart. And and if we do anything to trees now, we make sort of very neat cuts with chainsaws, which don't actually create any habitat. But if you start ripping trees up a bit instead, you're sort of winching branches off, or doing what they call fracture pruning, where you cut at strategic points so that branches shear off with a great untidy scar, then you create all sorts of habitat which a chainsaw by itself doesn't create. There are even some people using explosives to blow trees up. So that you create this sort of ripped up hollow trees, and then maybe it's going a bit over the top, but that sort of thing is interesting because you do then changes your view of what an ecosystem should look like, because we're very tidy-minded. So we expect everything to be tidy. We expect the parks to be tidy. We expect the countryside to be tidy. And tidiness is the enemy of nature. We need a mess. We need to turn this country into a bloody great mess. And the wonderful thing about some of the keystone species, and wild boar, are wonderful for this, and elephants, of course, are even better, is that they make a mess. And mess It means lots of tiny little micro niches, micro habitats, microclimates, all the rest of it, that you create some micro humidity pockets and all of that you don't get in these very polished ecosystems that we tend to create and preserve. And that requires an act of public persuasion. And I think a big part of that is to talk about our paleoecology, is to talk about what there was. And it's exciting, you know, it's not like you've got to sit you down and tell you about these amazing animals which used to live in this country. You know, it's thrilling. It's thrilling. For me, paleoecology, which is essential to understanding ecosystems today, is like passing through a portal into an enchanted kingdom. And if we can get people as excited about the megafauna of the previous interglacial as they are about dinosaurs, then we're halfway towards getting them to accept untidy habitats. So a man on this side, is the one? Yep. That side, the man here.
You have 5 minutes?
Yes, that's right, and then we'll have a couple more questions after this.
You've said in previous talks about how the kind of neoliberal terminology for ecology, like how natural landscapes are now referred to as green infrastructure. And I was just wondering if you had any strategies about how to get them to adopt the more natural value of nature, or if you think it's naive to think that you can do that.
Well, thank you. I do think the language we use is very important, and I think the language is stultifying, not just a new language of asset classes within an ecosystem market, or green infrastructure, which we used to, hills and rivers, that's what we used to call them. Obviously that's a very outmoded term. I'm sorry, I know there's someone in here who's promoting green infrastructure stuff. I won't go on about this too much, but there's all this sort of marketisation of nature thing. I think that's a disaster. But I think the old language too is really useless. Cite a special scientific interest, for God's sake, who does that ever inspire? No take zones, it's such a negative term, or even worse, the current term for them, reference areas. Like the only purpose of having a place where you don't send beam trawlers and scallop dredgers over is so that it's a reference area with which to compare other things. So it's of use to scientists, but it's no use to the rest of us. Reserves. What do you think of if someone's reserved? They're austere, they're removed from you. That someone just sort of keep at arm's length, or they keep you at arm's length. That's not what we want to encourage at all. And I think we do need a whole new language of engagement with nature. And one of the things we're hoping to do through Rewilding Britain is to have a workshop pulling together poets and thinkers in this area, and experts in framing and linguistics, cognitive linguistics, and try to recreate a new language of nature, which is going to be much more enticing and engaging and enchanting. Try to fill that language with enchantment in the same way as we want to fill the living world once more with enchantment. So I'm going to take a couple more quick questions on this side, one from a woman, one from a man. Perhaps a woman there closest to you, Phil?
Hello, thanks again for the talk, it was really inspiring. I've just got a question that's mainly about the transition towards rewilding. So I work for the Wildlife Trust based in Bristol, which is Avon Wildlife Trust, and we spend a lot of time doing what you have sort of mentioned, which is cutting and burning. But that's mainly on really sort of steep slope areas which are actually rewilding as we talk, but at the expense of some of the habitats people are losing, which is sort of wildflower grasslands. And so I was just wondering what you think about how that transition will work without losing any of that biodiversity and the associated invertebrates and things that we really value, especially in terms of pollination and that kind of thing, which we talk about a lot.
Thank you. No, thank you. It's a very good question. I'm not proposing that in all little nature reserves they should be rewilded and allowed to reforest and stuff like that, because these are places which are greatly valued by local people for what they are. I don't want to sort of trash all the wildflower meadows and stuff like that, even though I recognise that they're only barely ecologically functional, and they've got a tiny fragment of life. We said, oh, look how diverse they are because of the flowers and the butterflies. You can forget all the other species which could be living there. Where sort of more forested ecosystems are likely to be far more diverse when you count the full panoply of species, rather than just those two clades, those two taxa, which we tend to focus on. But even so, these are much loved by people and people want to keep them as they are. I completely recognise that. But at the same time, all groups, including the Wildlife Trust, sees the need for much bigger, the conservation taking place on a much larger scale, landscape scale conservation. You use a term, what's the term the Wildlife Trust use for it? Can you remember? Living landscapes, that's the one. And you know, and that's widely accepted, but the question is, what are we going to do on that much bigger scale? Are we going to replicate this anally retentive model of conservation we have on the small scale, or are we going to do something much more interesting? And when you've got a bigger scale to play with, I really hope we're not going to do the micromanagement and the cutting and the burning and the grazing and the rest of it. I hope we're going to do something much more interesting and dynamic with a lot more ecological function in it. And this isn't to diss the sort of work you're doing. I mean, the sort of work that they do in the uplands, which is just pointless and thoughtless, and you know, and it's not like there's any great local love of what's being done, keeping these places bare and blasted. I would love to see that change. But some of the tiny reserves in the lowlands, yeah, you can call them gardens if you like, but people really appreciate them as they are. So yeah, I'm happy to leave them that way. But when we're talking about big scale, then let's start thinking on a large scale rather than a sort of Blairite micromanagement of everything we survey. So one more question on this side. Sorry, there's loads. Man in the blue shirt. Yeah, just that. And this will be the last. I'm sorry. I'd love
Thanks,
to carry
Chris.
on.
Been really interesting and inspiring. Two things I would be interested in hearing more about. Firstly, there's another George today in Manchester talking about the evolution of powers away from London to cities and other regions. Is there an opportunity there for the stuff that you're talking about? And finally, I think it would be great to end on what we can do next, how we can get involved in Rewilding Britain.
Thank you very much. Well, so far I've been connected to George Galloway and George Osborne. Thank you. I'm changing my name forthwith. And I wish to be known as Wolf. Yes, look, there are opportunities here. Yeah, and the thing is about these, you know, we sort of almost have to sort of rewild our way into this. And we just say, right, we might not like where it's coming from. And we might not like the purpose of it, which is bound to be nefarious, it is George Osborne doing. Yeah. But you know, if there's an opportunity there, we should take it, and we should, and we should. It's just like with the review of the Habitats and Birds Directive that you were talking about. That you know, we might not like the reason they're doing it, but it can open up opportunities, and this leads into the second part of your question, which is, you know, what can we do? Well, you know, what we're trying to do in Rewilding Britain is going to be a very small organisation. It's going to remain a very small organisation. That we don't want it to turn into some huge thing. And it's not going to be handing down solutions to people. It's going to be encouraging people to do their own initiatives, which we then support and publicise, raise money for, do whatever's most appropriate, whatever's most needed, while at the same time lobbying and doing advocacy on the national level to try to make a better environment, political environment, for those things to be able to flourish. So what I really want to hear from people is not, you know, how can Rewilding Britain start things off in their areas, but for them to come to us and say, this is what we're starting in our area, how can you help us with it? And the notion of rewilding that I'm trying to spread is not a narrow or linear one, saying, you know, this is what rewilding looks like, there's only one kind of rewilding, then this is what you have to do to qualify. But it's to say, here's this idea. Rewilding is an idea. It's an idea which has already got loads of definitions. And there are one or two which appeal to me in particular, you know, which is the mass restoration of ecosystems on the one hand, and the rewilding of our own lives, making our lives richer and rawer and filling them with wonder and enchantment. But there are other definitions as well, which you know, beginning to spread. It's a word which begins to spread, but the notion of it, the notion of sort of not being completely planned and ordered and process-led, but you know, not being process-led, but allowing processes to develop, so that the process is the outcome. You know, we're not trying to get to a particular point, but we're going to allow living systems to develop and evolve and to go through successional stages without us locking them down at a particular place. but perhaps do the same with our own lives and our own ways of getting there as well. That instead of being quite so prescriptive about how we try to do things, we allow change to bubble up from below, a reverse trophic cascade, if you like. But, you know, we allow local people, community groups to interpret this in their own way, and then to come up with ways in which rewilding could work at their own level. Because, you know, what's going to work in Bristol is going to be completely different than what's going to work in the Cairngorms. And you know, in the little seminar we had this afternoon, there were all sorts of really interesting ideas came out from a mixed group of people about what could be done in Bristol. And some of them were completely new to me. I said, oh, you know, my neurons were firing on all cylinders, because I went, oh yeah, that's an interesting idea, and that's an interesting idea. I could never have had those ideas and proposed them to the people in that room. And I would love to see that organic process begin to develop in communities everywhere. And if there is devolution to cities and to regions and the rest of it, well, then there are bound to be more opportunities for that to happen. We hope what we could do is at the national level is to stop governments from spiking those opportunities. It's basically to clear a bit of political space in which those things can flourish. And by doing so, I hope to enrich both the wildlife and the human life in this nation. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've been privileged this evening to have an insightful, challenging, and I have to say, entertaining talk, George. Thank you so much. I think you put a challenge to Bristol to explore for itself what rewilding might mean. And this university will want to be part of that conversation. There are people in this room who will feel passionately about the opportunity. And the university will provide a place in which some of those conversations can take place. So we hope that you will come back to Bristol again and we can share the proceeds of those thoughts and we can help to take forward your rewilding adventure. So ladies and gentlemen, can we then extend on behalf of the university another round of thanks for George for a brilliant evening. Thank you very much.